Hello, everyone. Great to be back with you for another episode of Palestine This Week with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as always, it's a real pleasure to be with you again.
And as always, Nassim, it's a pleasure to be with you as well. Thank you for having me.
Maureen, I want to kick off today because we are approaching the second anniversary of the 7th October attack and the genocide that followed since. As we know, nearly 68,000 Palestinians have been killed, 83% of which, according to Israel's own statistics, are civilians. And the death toll is likely to be much, much higher given that those who are under the rubble and many are unaccounted for. And you have estimates as high as 186,000 according to Lancet. So there's a lot of horrors that have been unaccounted for. And negotiations are currently underway in Cairo as we speak. So we want to discuss that as well. But I want to kick off, as I said, with just getting your thoughts and reflecting on the fact that we are reaching the 2-year anniversary,
Mhm.
and right off the bat, say, when this all kicked off 2 years ago, I did not imagine Israel's military assault to last as long as it has. I assumed, Israel would meet its stated objective, which is destroying Hamas and securing the release of the hostages. Uh, but despite, turning Gaza into rubble, it has achieved neither. So that's just my initial thoughts on that. But I want to get your, observations 2 years on. What are the key points, key issues that you're thinking about after 2 years?
Yeah. I mean, it's surprising that even if one accepts, as I think most thinking people do, that Israel's intention from the very outset was to commit genocide and to ensure that the Gaza Strip is no longer fit for human habitation, that even using that criteria, it's taken them 2 years and to achieve this. I mean, they're still demolishing housing stock. They're still destroying infrastructure. They're still trying to force people out of certain regions of the Gaza Strip. And, we're talking about a territory that's half the size of New York City. We're not talking about Scotland here. Um, and to think that it has taken the Israeli military 2 whole years and it's still busy, I think tells you something, first of all, about the quality of its fighting forces. And secondly, tells you about what the situation would be had it not been for the unconditional and unlimited support that Israel has received from its Western sponsors and allies. First and foremost among that support, of course, has been total impunity to do as it pleases with the Palestinian people. Now, returning back to October 7th, the Israeli version is basically nothing justifies October 7th, but October 7th justifies everything. That's, I think, how it was very well put by Palestinian analyst Diana Boutou. Second point, and related to it, is that history began on October 7th, 2023. The only relevant history before October 7th, 2023 is the Holocaust. Nothing else is relevant, and therefore we need to understand um, October 7th in the context of the Holocaust and Israel's response in the context of ensuring that Jews are never exterminated again. This is, of course, completely, ludicrous nonsense because what happened in October 2023 had nothing to do with Europe during the 1940s and everything to do with the Middle East since the 1940s. As we've discussed before, the Gaza Strip exists only because of Israel. Prior to 1948, no one had ever heard of the Gaza Strip because it didn't exist. It was created as a result of the Palestine War and as a result of the Nakba. Then you had more than half a century of occupation beginning in 1967. With Israel's disengagement in 2005, you had the imposition of a punishing blockade on the Gaza Strip. And it was quite clear that the status quo was untenable. And one way or another, there was going to be a response. But the Biden administration, like US administrations before it, rather than addressing the root causes of this crisis and seeking to address and resolve them by ensuring that its proxy, Israel, lives up to its commitments and obligations, um, sought instead to leapfrog the question of Palestine and to use Arab Israeli normalization as a lever with which to further marginalize the Palestinians, isolate them, and leave their future to be resolved unilaterally, not only by Israel, but by the most extreme government in Israeli history. And it was showing on the ground. And I think it is in that context that we need to understand the Palestinian attacks of October 7th, 2023, an effort to irrevocably shatter the status quo. Now, whether one wants to look for analogies in history and the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968 or the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s or anywhere else, it's quite clear that some form of response was inevitable, that in the context of Israel brutally suppressing any effort at nonviolent or legal or diplomatic Palestinian efforts to achieve their rights, that made a violent response to Israel's policies increasingly likely and ultimately inevitable. Were atrocities committed on October 7th? Of course they were. Was October 7th a pogrom whose sole purpose was simply to kill as many Israelis who, of course, were only allowed to think of as Jews to make the connection with the Holocaust? Was that the purpose? Of course not. There were military targets. There were also civilian targets. Um, Civilians were taken hostage. Soldiers were also taken captive. Now, what happened is that October 7th did irrevocably shatter the status quo. But what we've seen so far is that Israel has successfully used it as an opportunity to resolve its Gaza problem, its Palestinian problem, and indeed its regional problem once and for all. And if we look at reality today, it would be easy to conclude that Israel is on the verge of imposing its dominance over the region for another generation, something akin to what it achieved in June of 1967. But that's not a reading I would endorse because I do think we have reached a turning point and a historical turning point. There are clouds gathering on the horizon. I don't think that Israel has the capacity to sustain the dynamic of perpetual war, of regional dominance, of constantly attacking its neighbors, adversaries, enemies, and even neutral states and informal allies, as it's now doing. And my personal view is that for Israel, it's downhill from here. You could, of course, argue, of course, Palestinians have paid the greatest price, and you could argue this is a lose situation. But I do believe that if we were to resume this conversation a decade from now, we will look back at the past 2 years as a time of extraordinary, unprecedented suffering, of genocide, of dispossession, of famine, and all the rest of it. And we will also look back at it as a historic turning point from which Israel was never able to recover, and which ultimately will mean either the beginning of the end of the Zionist project or a process whereby it's increasingly constrained. If I could just make one last point, I do think that the era of unrestricted Israeli impunity is gradually being chipped away at as well. We're already seeing this, the idea of ICC warrants against Putin, where I think much more believable than anything against even a minor Israeli corporal. But here we have Netanyahu indicted. Big unanswered question, of course, is what's going to happen in the region. I've previously compared it to 1948, where the failure, refusal of the Arab leaders to lift a finger in support of not only the Palestinians, but of what most Arabs themselves see as an Arab cause, as Arab national security. In other words, they see it not only as solidarity with others, but as a question of sticking up for their own rights and interests. And I think that the collective failure of Arab leaderships and governments to lift a finger during the past 2 years is going to come back and haunt them as well. In what form, when, where, how is anyone's guess. But I think it would be foolish to presume that Arab governments will be simply able to put this behind them as they did in 48 and 67. It didn't work then either.
We'll speak about the Arab governments and their role. I wanted to go back to a point you made earlier about clouds gathering for Israel going into the future. Um, and I or to quote a phrase by Pinkaj Mishara, "The world after Gaza." He has a book on that. The world after Gaza seems to have turned on the Palestinian axis, and you mentioned a few examples. One could look at Gaza now and look at the demolition and the destruction and how Israel has completely shattered and crushed Palestinian resistance. You could make that argument. But on the other hand, as we mentioned at the beginning, Hamas is still standing. And because Hamas is still fighting, Israel is seeking other means through which to achieve what it failed to do on the battlefield, which is through the aid of American help and the Arab countries is seeking to disarm Hamas because it's failed to do that on the battlefield. So it shows its weakness. Um, but on top of that, we've seen many of the pillars on which Israel stands on is shaking. You mentioned a few. What are the other key pillars that you think has been shaken by what's happened over the past 2 years? Pillars on which Israel has rested on for to carry out its genocide, and before that to garner support from Western countries and Arab states. What are the key weaknesses that you're seeing?
Well, there are several. I think first and foremost, Israel loves to present itself as, defending itself by itself, that it is Israel that is doing those who flood it with arms and ammunition and money. It's doing them the favor because, in the words of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, it's doing the West's dirty work. Um, what we've learned, or what those who didn't know it have learned during the past 2 years, is how utterly and extraordinarily dependent Israel is on its allies for its very survival, let alone for its ability to perpetrate a genocide. We're not talking here about South Africa, which was a large country with massive resources and had natural resources that the world not only wanted but needed. This is a small state, a small society, a small military, a nuclear power, yes, extremely powerful, yes. But strip away its trade relationship with the European Union, strip away its privileged relationship with the United States, and there's nothing left. Um, that's kind of at the, let's say, concrete level. The other thing that has changed fundamentally, and here I'm speaking primarily of the West rather than more broadly the international community, is that Israel has tended to be seen as a state that came into existence for a moral reason and a moral purpose. Of course, anyone who knows anything about it would be flabbergasted by this assessment, but it's true, particularly among older people who have who either experienced or have memories of the Second World War. Israel is seen as the response to the German Holocaust, Germany's campaign to exterminate the Jews of Europe during the Second World War. Um, to see Israel not only perpetrating genocide, but to see it doing it so gleefully, and to see it on the one hand basically saying it has the right to do this, and on the other hand claiming that everything you're seeing is fake, but most importantly to see it formally charged with genocide by genocide scholars, by Holocaust scholars, by human rights organizations, by journalists, by the International Court of Justice, I think has fundamentally and irreversibly transformed Israel's image in the global and particularly in the Western imagination. Israel can no longer use the suffering of the Jews in Europe as a shield with which to deflect any and all criticism of its policies and practices in the Middle East. Those days are over. And the other thing that I think related to this, the other thing I think that people have now understood is that Israel is right when it was always claiming to be judged by a different standard, but it was not being judged by a different standard in the way that its apologists and flunkies claim. Israel has been permitted, allowed, enabled, supported to conduct atrocities, to engage in practices that no other state would be allowed to. And I think there is an increasing demand that Israel should no longer be held to a different standard, should no longer be judged by a different standard, should no longer be treated as a class all its own, and needs to be viewed, examined, judged, and held to account no differently than any other state. I mean, you now have this crazy situation where in a number of countries, and particularly the United States, there's more tolerance for criticism, for condemnation, even for calls for destruction of that state itself than it is of the foreign entity named Israel. There was recently a law passed, I believe, in Texas um, that considers burning the American flag protected speech, but burning the Israeli flag a criminal offense. I mean, one could perhaps find it understandable that an Israeli judge would rule like this. But imagine that you have legal systems that basically say a foreign state is more sacred than your own. They've gone so over the top with seeking to um, seeking to protect Israel from any and all criticism, that I think people are now onto it, that they're doing this for a reason, because the history of Israel is one big atrocity, of which the Gaza genocide is only the culmination. And increasingly, people are taking to the streets to bring this to an end.
Mm. And for all those reasons you mentioned, we are seeing Israel launch this incredible campaign to propagandize and
Yeah.
gaslit, I would say, the international community, which is why it is making the purchases it's making in the US. We'll discuss all that later on in our show today. But before that, I want to touch on or get your thoughts on the negotiations, the ceasefire negotiations that are currently taking place in Cairo right now. Last week we saw it seemed like every party were seeking to just please Trump. That seemed to be the objective. Everyone's agreeing with Trump, and Trump seems to be aiming to get his hands on the Nobel Peace Prize. That was his primary objective, I guess. But where are we now with that? I mean, we should keep in mind we are where we are. because Israel or Netanyahu has preferred or opted or prioritized the destruction of Gaza over the release of the hostages. That is why we are where we are. Because over the past 2 years, there have been a number of occasions where Israel could have secured the release of all the hostages for in exchange for ending the genocide and withdrawing from Gaza. That was always on the table, but Israel never took that up. So where are we now in terms of the negotiations? And can you see Hamas compromise on those two key points, which is in exchange for the release of the hostages, Israel has to withdraw and Israel has to end its genocide?
Well, the Trump proposal and the ensuing negotiations are really about three separate sets of issues. The first is the immediate situation, an exchange of captives, an Israeli withdrawal, and an end to the war, to the genocide. And the questions here are, uh, according to what schedule will the remaining Israeli captives be released, um, which and how many Palestinian captives will be released in exchange, um, how will Israel withdraw as part of this exchange, and what guarantees will the Palestinians obtain that the genocide won't resume. And I think the negotiations are very much fixed on that, where I think for Hamas, an absolute priority is to ensure that Palestinian leaders who have been in prison for decades, like Marwan Barghouti, like Ahmed Saadat, the Secretary General of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, like some of Hamas's own leaders, that these are all released. And for Hamas, it's particularly important that leaders who are not members of Hamas are released, because then it can present itself as having acted in the national interests rather than purely according to factional considerations. And it is precisely for that reason that Israel will fight tooth and nail not to have these people released. And it will have a silent partner in this, which is Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, who also see these people as a threat to their own legitimacy and rule if they are released from prison. So that's the first issue. Second issue is will Israel, as Hamas is demanding, fully withdraw from the Gaza Strip as part of the exchange? And I should just add, I think the parties are now agreed that the exchange will take place at the outset of an agreement rather than in stages. And it's for that reason that Hamas is demanding a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. How is this going to be settled? Um, will will Hamas have to accept Israel remaining within parts or much or most of the Gaza Strip? And the third is, will this just be a temporary lull in the fighting while Hamas retrieves and releases the captives and then the genocide removes? Will it be a pause, or will it be a sustained end of hostilities with international guarantees? So those are the issues that are really being negotiated now. And I would argue the deadline is the 10th of October, because that's when the Nobel Committee announces the winner of the Peace Prize. And if it's not Donald Trump, he may just lose interest and say, okay, do whatever you want, no longer interests me. But the second set of issues that are going to be negotiated is, if indeed a durable ceasefire is achieved, is governance of the Gaza Strip. You know, Hamas long ago accepted that it would not be involved in the governance of the Gaza Strip, and this, of course, has been a demand of the others. But then you get into a whole viper's nest, if you will, of competing interests. Um, Israel insists that the Gaza Strip be fully separated from the West Bank and not be governed by Palestinians. The Americans, acting through Witkoff and Jared Kushner and Tony Blair, have set up this kind of colonial apparatus, which will govern Palestinians digitally by remote control. I think we discussed it last week. And the Arab states who are expected to fund and man this apparatus with a stabilization force and so on are demanding that the governance be Palestinian and embedded in a credible political process. And that's the third issue, which is the political future. Are you going to address the question of Palestine? If so, how? How are you going to resolve it? And so on. Rather than getting into detail on the second and third set of issues, let me just say that I suspect the negotiations are very much focused on the first issue, that for a variety of reasons, they will probably achieve at least partial and temporary success, but that it is unlikely that we are going to see a comprehensive end to the Gaza genocide. I'm thinking of something akin to the ceasefire we have in Lebanon, where the Palestinians cease fire and Israel can continue bombing at will. And I certainly don't see serious effort to address and resolve the underlying political crisis, which set the stage for the past 2 years, unless the Arab governments began using their very real leverage with both Israel and the United States, as a result of which the West begins to use its leverage with Israel. But I simply don't see that happening.
Mm. And I think that is the second point is where there will be major sticking point. And Hamas has come out and said that it will not surrender or give up its arms unless there is a Palestinian entity as opposed to a colonial tool in the shape of Tony Blair governing Gaza. That's where the major stumbling block is. And there are now leaked documents showing the real intention of what this entity, led by Tony Blair, is seeking to do in Gaza. You have the Arab countries whose end goal seems to be, of course, a pathway to a two-state solution, and everything they do has to lead towards that. And on the other hand, you've got the Israelis who want to completely undermine that effort, and their goal is to basically siege Gaza, keep Gaza within a concentration camp, and continue to do that. So there is no way where those two goals can align. So
Those lines do not intersect.
they do not intersect. So how can Arab countries, if their aim is to see a two-state solution, sign up to something like this without an imposition from Trump, who, as you said, who may lose interest after the deadline for the Nobel Peace Prize is gone. He may just wipe his hands, and then what we'll see is a resumption. So I do envisage Hamas releasing the hostages, but I
Yeah.
don't, like you, I don't envisage that they will disarm, lay down their arms, because they know Israel's goal is not to create a pathway to a two-state solution. Their goal is to keep Gaza and, of course, the West Bank under under decades of occupation.
Yeah. Well, imagine a situation in which you have a ceasefire, you have an exchange of captives. All the Israeli captives dead and alive are released. Key Palestinian captives are released from Israel's prison system. You have a substantial, perhaps even more or less full, Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and you have a ceasefire that is, not a real ceasefire, but is not kind of the constant, intensive genocide that we've been seeing now. And then you don't have agreement on any of these other issues, governance, administration, and so on. From Israel's point of view, things could be worse because that means the blockade continues. That means reconstruction will be exceedingly slow, if at all. That means you have created conditions of life within the Gaza Strip that will remain impossible and growing numbers of Palestinians may well choose, perhaps even be assisted, to try to leave the Gaza Strip. And Hamas and the other Palestinian groups in the Gaza Strip are, from Israel's perspective, on the one hand, sufficiently weakened that they can not do anything remotely approaching the 2023 attacks, but by still being there and not being disarmed, they will provide Israel with a pretext to continue attacking the Gaza Strip at will. And from Israel's perspective, you could do a lot worse. And that way, you don't have to have any discussion about eventual Palestinian governance, about addressing the underlying political crisis, and so on. And I think, from the perspective of Israel's sponsors and allies in the West, if that gets Gaza out of the headlines, and reduces popular mobilization against government policies, that's all for the better. You know, we're now at a crossroads. Um, we're either going to go into this endless tunnel akin to Oslo of protracted negotiations about meaningless details that provide no serious resolution of anything, but that will be dominating the headline and be used as camouflage, as a fig leaf to hide and even to change reality. That's the one fork in the road. And the other is the growing mobilization of popular opinion and even of some governments around the world to ensure that Israel is held accountable for its crimes and can no longer act with impunity, and to ensure that Palestinian rights are not just ink on paper, but are translated into concrete reality. And I would argue it is precisely now, at junctures like this, that it is absolutely vital not only to continue, but to redouble our efforts, because we also don't want to go back to a situation in Oslo where the sacredness of the process, the need to preserve the process at any cost, was consistently used as a pretext not to address the increasingly deteriorating and worsening situation on the ground.
You mentioned Palestinian concern. I think one of the themes one could point to throughout over the past 100 years is the fact that Palestinian concern in every negotiation or every so-called solution has been on the outer periphery. It's never been a concern, and we see that on this occasion as well. And there was a leaked document, which I think you shared with me, and it clearly showed how real financial returns seems to be the number one priority of this plan that's been, cooked up by Blair and the others. And proposals suggest that few billionaires would sit at the top of this entity, and it would include a number of bodies, but only one token Palestinian. Who that Palestinian is, how you qualify to be in that board is still unclear. But the aim seems to be, real financial returns. That's the goal, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, if Tony Blair is involved, you can rest assured there are two other things involved: crime and money. And that's precisely the case here. I mean, the the Gaza Strip is supposed to be some cash cow for Blair, for Kushner, for this board they're setting up, in which they're literally milking human suffering for money. That's exactly what they're doing, and turning the Gaza Strip and its suffering, turning genocide into an investment opportunity. Um, this is not a structure that is being put in place to promote Palestinian rights, but rather to control Palestinians and to ensure that Palestinians remain subordinate to Israel. Now, there are all kinds of, in this document, again, the fundamental principle is that Palestinians will not have the right to govern themselves. They will be governed by outsiders. Um, Blair, having such a stellar record in the Middle East, is of course going to be in charge of this. But the idea of Palestinian self-determination is nipped in the bud. Even the idea of Palestinian self-government and autonomy, which which at least was part of the Oslo agreement, that is now off the table as well. And Palestinians will become hewers of wood and drawers of water for Tony Blair, Jared Kushner, Inc., LLC. And it's not going to fly. I mean, even if the structure is set up, and even if it is put in place, and even if it begins to be implemented, it's ultimately going to be as successful as the military occupation. It's not sustainable. Palestinians are not going to take this lying down.
Mm.
They are not going to accept being turned into a business opportunity for a bunch of crooks from Europe and the United States and Israel.
Mm. I think last week when we ended our show, we were having that conversation, and I think we were correct in our assumption, which was that Palestinian Hamas will seek changes to the
Yes.
proposal, and it's not going to accept every um, item in the proposal. And that's how it turns out. And I think in the long term, it doesn't look like the second part of the proposal, which is the creation of this entity to look colonial entity, is going to work. The first part, as I said, I do expect Hamas to
Yeah.
release all the hostages. Um, just moving on, I wanted to just shift our focus from Gaza and Palestine to what is happening in the US, because of course they're all very related. And we mentioned earlier on that the pillars on which Israel rests is shaking, and one of the pillars is the influence and the domination of the information system in the West. And we saw a number of um, reports last week of how Israel is seeking to dominate uh, the social media world. First, there was a report with uh, statecraft, something I forgot the name of the website, but it published an article saying Israel is actually paying
Responsible statecraft.
responsible statecraft. Sorry,
Mhm.
that's it. £7,000 per tweet. It's an awful amount, showing exactly how they're seeking to dominate what I would now call the eighth front of Israel's war. It's fighting war in Gaza, the West Bank, against Lebanon, against Iran, against the Houthis. And the information war is literally the eighth front of Israel's new campaign. And many Israelis, I've seen a number of videos in the US where many pro-Israeli activists are saying that we cannot lose this information war. It is the most important of all the different fronts. This is the most important one. And you're now seeing um, shifts and maneuvers that are taking shape. And part of that is the payment of £7,000. And now you're seeing a former Trump advisor, social media advisor, being recruited by the Israelis to pump out social media content to influence the Gen Z, the very Gen Z which is turning against Israel. And then same week, we saw a purchase of TikTok by Larry Ellison, one of the biggest funders of the Israeli army. This clearly looks like a recognition by Israel that it has lost the information war, is taking countermeasures. Whether they will work or not, we will have to wait and see. But it seems desperate to want to now shape the information, system around the world.
Look, we no longer live in a world where if you don't like what you see on BBC One, your only alternative option is BBC Two. If you don't like ABC, then it's either CBS or NBC. The world isn't like that anymore. There are so many platforms and so on with new ones emerging. I mean, how many, Facebook was all the rage a decade or two ago. How many people under 25 even have Facebook accounts? So the idea that you can somehow seize the airwaves, control the media the way that would have been possible before is a pipe dream. So, what Israel and its allies are focusing on is purchasing key legacy media, like CBS, like CNN. Who even watches them, in order to control their messaging? Um, and social media, like the wildly popular TikTok. But do people really believe that once TikTok loses its freedom and becomes highly controlled and regulated and tells you what to think, that people are going to stay there, or that they're somehow not going to be able to have access to reality through other platforms? And by the way, if I should just add, supreme irony here is that TikTok is, of course, a Chinese developed platform, an application, and Israel and the United States have waged war against it because it's too free. you know, the uh, Chinese freedom of expression needs to be restrained and controlled and repudiated by the country that poses as a leader of the free world, not to serve American interests. No one is ever claiming that TikTok needs to be strangled because of its attacks on the United States to defend Israel. So here again, you have the United States prioritizing a foreign government over itself. It's beyond words. But the broader point is that yes, um, it may cause a temporary decline and outrage against Israel and so on, and people will have less access. But if they really think that shooting one messenger after another, the way that they've been murdering journalists in the Gaza Strip, is going to prevent the message from getting out, or is going to ensure that only their message reaches the broader public. They're living in the past. The dam has
Mm,
burst. The sea is flowing in at a record rate. You cannot rebuild a dam when it's flooded underwater. It's simply not going to happen. It's
mm,
game over for Israel. As for it's like trying to market apartheid as a human rights movement after Sharpeville and Soweto. Forget it.
You commented on a row that sparked last week. Again, American liberal commentators ignoring this shift that's taking place in the US, ignore and instead saying it's Chinese and Qatari influencers who are pumping out these images of dead babies, and ignoring the fact that Israel's literal or pro-Israeli billionaires are literally buying up American media space to pump out pro-Israeli propaganda and gaslight all of America. And they don't mention that. Instead, he goes on TV. I forgot his name now. What's his, he went on TV and then says, "These
Van
babies,
Jones.
Van Jones, these babies that are you're seeing images of, they're basically propaganda by China and
Yes.
Qatar. They're not really
No.
true." He
Yes.
apologized to his credit.
Iran and Qatar, those
Iran,
closest of
yeah,
allies. Yeah.
yeah, he apologized to his credit, but I think
No,
most
sorry,
people, yeah,
actually, it wasn't to his credit, and I'll explain why.
yeah. So do explain.
Well, so Van Jones is this kind of thoroughly repulsive liberal who, blows every way the wind does. I think immediately after October 8th, he was giving a speech in solidarity with Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and said we need to go after the Muslims or something like, typical American liberal. He was hosted on a show by this American frat boy comedian named Bill Maher. And the third guest was, the king of ignorance, New York Times columnist, Tom Friedman. And Van Jones was explaining that the real problem with youth becoming so hostile to Israel is that they're constantly seeing pictures of, in his words, dead Palestinian baby, dead Palestinian baby. And he turned it into a joke. In his own words, he turned it into a punchline. And the
Friedman
first,
laughed as well.
yes,
Friedman
well, the
laughed.
first to erupt in laughter were, of course, Friedman and frat boy Marr. And then, their audience dutifully followed. Because you can't have decades of constant systematic dehumanization of Palestinians and not have these kinds of scenes. So the miracle was not, the strange thing about this was not the way the frat boy host and the king of ignorance sitting next to him and their audience responded. That's par for the course. What surprised me is this backlash was so severe that the next day Jones offered what was supposed to be an apology. But here's the thing. Um, when Jones made his statement, he was making the claim that the only reason people are seeing these images is because of Iranian and Qatari propaganda. He was basically suggesting these are fake images that are being forced down children's corneas, youth's corneas by Tehran and Doha. And when he sought to offer an apology, he apologized for having used dead Palestinian babies as a punchline, in his words. Of course, didn't say a word about why there were so many dead Palestinian babies, because the apology was crafted not for Palestinians, but in a way that would not offend Israel. But he doubled down on why he was making that point, saying he was trying to highlight foreign manipulation of American media. And of course, the biggest manipulator of American media is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the biggest victim of foreign manipulation of media in the United States is, of course, Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, it's, Alice in Wonderland level lunacy.
Mm. Yeah, it was like really, really comical. Let's end though with two other news items I wanted to discuss with you. First one really, I think, goes to the heart of the tension between Israel and Jewish communities in the UK and elsewhere. In this context, the UK. So this was related to the Israel's Minister of Diaspora. His name is Amichai Chekli. So
Yes.
he invited Tommy Robinson. This is this far right extremist in the UK. Even the Jewish communities in the UK, the main Jewish bodies who support Israel, they describe him as a thug, as a far right extremist. And this is not a person who Israel should be inviting to their country, hosting him in the Knesset. So this, of course, demonstrated what many Jews throughout history have said, that Israel is making life unsafe for Jews. There's a tension between Jews in the West and the state of Israel. The first example I could cite is Edwin Samuel Montague. He was a prominent Jewish liberal politician, one of few cabinet members, and he opposed the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
And sorry,
He,
he was the only member of the British cabinet to vote against adoption of the Balfour
That's right.
Declaration.
I mean, his argument being, or his logic being, that it would endanger Jewish safety in the West,
Right.
fuel anti-Semitism with accusations of Jew loyalty, and of course violate the rights of the Palestinian people. So every one of those points of opposition is turning out to be, of course, true. And we see this tension now playing out because Israel, its alignment is with the neo-Nazis and the far-right extremists, where the interest of Jews in the West is to have an open, liberal society. That is their aim, whereas Israel's aim is to align with the fascists and the extremists. So this tension is playing out in a really dangerous way for Jews in the West.
Yeah, I mean, this is really fascinating. I think it was Hannah Arendt who, already in the 1950s, wrote that it was virtually inevitable that over time you would have a schism between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, and with Israeli Jews, as you suggested, going in an increasingly militaristic, right-wing supremacist direction, while diaspora Jews would maintain this commitment to, let's say, liberal, open societies in which they would be able to have their natural role. Now, of course, Jewish societies are not monolithic, and you do, of course, have extreme right-wing elements within them. You have left-wing elements, and so on. But I think it's fair to say that on the whole, these Jewish communities tend to be more tend to be disproportionately liberal compared to the general population, and the far right in these countries, whether Jews or otherwise, are very closely aligned with Israel, and now Israel is increasingly closely aligned with them. So, in the case of this neo-fascist Tel Aviv Tommy, as he's also known, Tommy Robinson, he was he's basically going to be given a hero's welcome in Israel, and that has caused deep opposition among the established Jewish leadership, Jewish community leadership, kind of the organized Jewish leadership that has been the traditional vehicle of serving Israel's interests in the UK, the Board of Deputies, and so on. And true to form, Robinson came out against them and said they're part of the problem. They're the people who have been advocating for open borders. And so, for good measure, bought in a number of anti Semitic tropes and so on. But of course, from Israel's perspective, these people are not judged by their love or hatred to Jews, they're judged by their Zionism. And as long as they're loyal to Israel, what they think or feel or say about Jews is completely irrelevant. Um, Israel doesn't care whether you're neutral to Jews or friendly to Jews or a raging anti Semite. As long as you support Israel, you can think whatever you want about Jews. And now you're having a similar problem in the US. There was a recent poll that shows that most American Jews either believe Israel is guilty of genocide or is perpetrating war crimes. Um, the chief commissar, Israel's chief commissar in the United States, a fellow by the name of Jonathan Greenblatt, who heads the Defamation League, um, was just told by the new far right director of the FBI that they're no longer welcome, that the partnership is over. And of course, the government has been a key vehicle through which Greenblatt's organization has been able to enforce politically correct thinking in the United States. So you're beginning to see this fracture where Israel's traditional allies are being excommunicated, if you will, by the far right, and Israel is replacing them with the far right.
Yeah, I think that there's a critical moment, I think, coming on this issue. And I was pleasantly surprised, I should say, when I read even Melanie Phillips. She is a staunch devotee of Israel. I would say Islamophobic, hates Muslims and migrants and whatnot. And she even came out with an article in Substack saying that Israel is making life for Jews unsafe. And then she wrote an article saying it's a very stupid and dangerous mistake to invite Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, but if
And
anyone else says it, they're of course a
of course,
Nazi. Yeah.
they're Nazis. So, yeah, I mean, I think where this leads to is, again, some Jews uh, do not deserve, in the words of, I would say, Peter Beinart, who came out this week in response to Israel boarding the Gaza global Samud flotilla and capturing someone by the name of David Adler, who is a Jew. But there's not been a peep out of anybody regarding his safety and the safety of others who are on board that ship. So Peter Beinart, who is a American commentator, Jewish American commentator, used to be a staunch Zionist, probably is in some shape or form. He came out and said, and I quote, "Why aren't the establishment Jewish groups who talk constantly about Jewish safety demanding that David Adler go free? Because when Jews defy Israel, their safety no longer matters.
Exactly.
They cease being a Jew at all because for the American Jewish establishment, Jews means pro-Israel. This is what happens when you make a state your God." So
Yeah.
it's quite a powerful statement. I thought I should read that out loud. And it's exactly what is happening now. Jews in the West who do not subscribe or support Israel, they
They're fair game.
basically they're fair game. They lose their Jewishness, and they're fair game like every other non-Jew.
And if I could just make a point, I mean, yes, there were a number of Jews on this Samud flotilla, and they, along with hundreds of others, were Western citizens. Now, imagine that any other Middle East government, um, an extremist government led by an indicted war criminal, abducts hundreds of Western citizens in an act of piracy from the high seas. What do you think the response of Western governments would have been if Iran did this, if Gaddafi did this, if the Houthis did this? Well, we know what the response would be because the Houthis did take a container ship, I think in late 23, and they've been repeatedly bombed in response. But I'm talking about, several hundred Western citizens. Imagine, the Security Council would have already passed 17,000 resolutions. Um, there wouldn't, the entire Middle East would look like the Gaza Strip. But because Israel did it, you've heard barely a peep. These governments won't even acknowledge their own citizens. They throw their own citizens to the wolves when the violator is Israel. Look at the United States. Look at all the US citizens that the Israeli military and Israeli settlers have murdered in recent years. The US has been very active on these cases, very active in covering them up and to ensure Israel does not pay a price for killing its own citizens. Imagine if Iran started hanging US citizens and executing them. Uh,
Well,
but
imagine if Iran waged a war on its citizens and arrested an 85-year-old blind man, which is exactly what happened
yes,
last weekend, because because the
yes,
UK has designated this entity as a terrorist organization, and now it's
mm,
arresting blind people, people who are handicapped. So this is the extent to which they're willing to go to defend Israel, wage a war on their own citizens to defend
yes,
Israel.
yeah, and that's what's changing. You know, Israel and its apologists ceaselessly whine that they're being held to a different standard as a way to cover up for the impunity they enjoy. And people now understand it is held to a different standard and are increasingly insisting it be held to the exact same standard as every other state and government and indicted war criminal. And to the extent that that campaign is successful, it will not end well for Israel.
And on that note, the point about the UK designating Palestine Action as a terrorist organization and the consequence of that, we saw this weekend, as I mentioned, uh, nearly 90-year-old blind man, 80 something years old, being arrested by the police. So you're seeing these shocking images. Now it turns out reports are that sections of the intelligence were opposed to this law,
Yeah.
designating, prescribing Palestine action because they know the consequences of that, and we're seeing that.
Yeah.
I don't know how long the UK can maintain this position. We'll have to wait and see, and how long they can continue to wage a war against their own citizens
Yeah.
to defend Israel. Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to this topic, Moin.
Yes.
As always, pleasure talking to you,
Thank
and
you.
hope we can continue our conversation next week. Not hope, we definitely we will
Yeah. I look
continue our
forward to
conversation
it.
next week. So thank you, and see you all. Thanks for tuning in. Bye bye.